When you think about one of Hollywood's most infamous tragedies, there's a name that often comes up, but maybe only as a footnote: Cathy Smith. And while she's usually just remembered for one single awful event, her life was so much more complex than any headline could ever capture.
And this this was the confession that just blew the entire case wide open. I mean, can you imagine? 4 months after John Belushi's death, Cathy Smith sells her story to the National Enquirer. And with those words, "I killed John Belushi," she went from just being a person of interest to the prime suspect. It was a statement that would literally define the entire rest of her life. So let's picture the scene. It's Bungalow 3 at the legendary Chateau Marmont. You know, this notorious hideaway for Hollywood's biggest stars. And it's here that John Belushi, the absolute force of nature from Saturday Night Live and Animal House, was found dead. He was just 33 years old. The cause of death? A lethal mix of heroin and cocaine. Which brings us to the big question, right? Before she was this notorious name in a tabloid, who was Cathy Smith? Because her story didn't start in that hotel bungalow, not even close. It started years and years earlier, deep inside the world of rock and roll.
Okay, so let's rewind. To really understand the woman who was there at the end of John Belushi's life, we first have to meet the muse who helped inspire some #1 hit songs.
See, she was way more than just a typical rock groupie. She wasn't just watching from the audience, she was in the inner circle. We're talking about touring with bands, becoming a close friend, a confidant, and even a muse to some of the biggest names of the era.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the two completely different sides of her influence. On one hand, you have the band. She was so connected with them that her name is even tied to their iconic song, The Wait. But then, her relationship with the Canadian folk legend Gordon Lightfoot, that was much, much darker. She was the direct inspiration for his massive hit Sundown, which is all about jealousy and suspicion, and it came directly out of their incredibly turbulent and sometimes violent affair. And Lightfoot himself admitted how intense it was. Their affair was so volatile that he once broke her cheekbone during a fit of rage. And that same jealousy, he channeled it straight into his most successful song. Their whole connection was this wild mix of passion, creativity, and, well, destruction.
So how does a rock and roll muse become a drug courier for the Hollywood elite? Well, this next chapter of her life marks a really significant and pretty dark downturn.
After her time with Lightfoot, Smith moved down to LA and started singing backup for the country singer Hoyt Axton. And it was around this time in the late 70s that she started using heroin. Pretty soon, she went from just using to dealing full-time, supplying drugs to some huge names, including, according to Bob Woodward's book, Wired, members of the Rolling Stones.
And this brings us right back to that awful week. Belushi checks into the chateau, and by March 4th, the place is a mess. Friends like Robert De Niro and Robin Williams even stopped by. Williams later said he was totally creeped out by Smith, calling her a lowlife. And later that night, by her own account, Smith starts injecting Belushi with drugs. By the next morning, he was gone.
So what exactly was she giving him? A drug cocktail called a speedball, and it's incredibly dangerous. You see, the cocaine is a stimulant, but the heroin is a depressant. Your body is getting two completely opposite signals at once, and it can just overwhelm the respiratory system, leading to overdose and death. So how many injections did she give him? According to her own story, she administered a staggering 11 speedballs to John Belushi that night. Just let that sink in for a second. 11. Well, that public confession in the Enquirer obviously set off a total firestorm, and it was only a matter of time before it led to criminal charges and a really long legal fight. The whole legal process was pretty straightforward. After that confession, she was charged. She'd actually fled to Canada, but she was extradited back to the US to face the music. And to avoid a long trial, she ended up pleading no contest to involuntary manslaughter. The result? A sentence of just 15 months in prison. And as soon as she was released, she was immediately deported. Back in Canada, she lived a much, much quieter life. She got a job as a legal secretary, and in a really profound twist of irony, she started speaking to teenagers, using her own unbelievable story to warn them about the dangers of drugs. So what is her legacy? Was she this cold-blooded villain, or was she something else entirely? This is where the story gets really contested.
In the definitive book on Belushi's life, Wired, the author Bob Woodward paints this really harsh picture. He described her as a flinty, hard-eyed woman, basically the hardened drug dealer at the end of a very tragic story. And for the millions of people who read that book, that became the image of Cathy Smith. But then, you get this. Gordon Lightfoot, the man who knew her so intimately during their chaotic affair, had a completely different opinion. Even after she was convicted, he insisted Cathy was a great lady. So which is it? The hard-eyed woman from the book, or the great lady her old flame remembered?
And here's why all this still matters. The Belushi case became bigger than just a celebrity death. It forced a national conversation about the entire ecosystem of addiction in Hollywood, about the people they called enablers. You know, the friends, the employees, the dealers who surround a star and shield them from any consequences, keeping the party going, right until it turns deadly. And whether it's fair or not, Cathy Smith became the face of that entire system. And the tragedy just echoed through the years in the most haunting way imaginable. Chris Farley, another huge talent from SNL, absolutely idolized John Belushi. He battled the very same demons with addiction. And then, in 1997, history repeated itself with this chilling precision. Farley also died at age 33 from a speedball overdose.
Cathy Smith herself passed away in 2020 up in British Columbia. She was 73 years old. But despite all the decades she lived before and after that night, her identity is, and probably always will be, tied to that bungalow, to that syringe, and to the death of a comedy legend.
So in the end, how do we remember her? Was she just the criminal who gave him the fatal dose? Or was she also a product of this destructive scene? A muse who was once celebrated and then cast aside, an addict who was lost in her own dependency, and maybe, just maybe, a convenient scapegoat for a culture that builds up its stars, enables them, and then just consumes them? The answer, a lot like the woman herself, remains profoundly complicated.